It was a historic day on Capitol Hill. We heard the first public testimony as part of the impeachment inquiry. Diplomats Bill Taylor and George Kent appeared side by side Wednesday, answering questions from the House Intelligence Committee. Taylor is the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. Kent is the Deputy Assistant Secretary overseeing policy in the region. Both previously testified behind closed doors. In his opening statement, Taylor revealed something new that was not included in his private deposition. He says a staff member overheard a call between the ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, and President Trump. Taylor says this happened in July, one day after the now highly scrutinized conversation the president had with Ukraine's leader.
A member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for.
Democrats quickly seized on the new information. Here's House Intelligence Chairman Adam Schiff.
And I think you said that after the call, when your staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought of Ukraine, his response was that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden. Is that right?
And Burisma, yes, sir.
And I take it the import of that is he cares more about that than he does about Ukraine.
Then there was this moment from Kent's opening statement, claiming he felt U.S. interests were being undermined in Ukraine for political purposes.
It was unexpected and most unfortunate, however, to watch some Americans, including those who allied themselves with corrupt Ukrainians in pursuit of private agendas, launch attacks on dedicated public servants advancing U.S. interests in Ukraine. In my opinion, those attacks undermined U.S. and Ukrainian national interests and damaged our critical bilateral relationship.
Meanwhile, Republicans repeatedly highlighted their views that both of these witnesses were not relying on firsthand accounts. Ranking Member Devin Nunes claimed the investigation was politically motivated.
And yet now, here we are. We're supposed to take these people at face value when they trot out a new batch of allegations. But anyone familiar with the Democrats' scorched earth war against President Trump would not be surprised to see all the typical signs that this is a carefully orchestrated media smear campaign.
President Trump said he was, quote, too busy to watch the hearings. He met with Turkish President Erdogan at the White House. However, he was tweeting throughout the day and told reporters this after the testimony was over.
All third-hand information, nothing direct at all. It can't be direct because I never said it. And all they have to do is look very, very simply at the transcript. If you read the transcript, this was analyzed by great lawyers. This was analyzed by Greg Jarrett. It was analyzed by Mark Levin. It was analyzed by everybody. They said this statement that I made, the whole call that I made with the president of Ukraine was a perfect one.
First, we have coverage from the White House, where CBS News White House correspondent Ben Tracy is standing by. So, Ben, we just heard that clip from President Trump. What else do we know about how the White House is reacting to the way Republicans in particular handled this testimony?
Well, at that news conference, President Trump doubled down, saying that he did not watch a single minute of this testimony today. He called it a hoax. And, you know, part of that is circumstance. The president had the president of Turkey here today, so he was in meetings all day and really couldn't sit down and watch this testimony as he might on a day where he had a lighter schedule. But some of that is also optics. The White House wants to make the president look like he is still being president, that he's doing the business of the people, and they want to make what's happening at the Capitol seem silly by comparison. So there is a little bit of a strategy there. We can tell you that people here at the White House were definitely watching the coverage of these hearings, and they were sending out kind of a rapid response talking points all day long about the testimony as it was happening. And a lot of that boils down to a phrase they used. They said, new testimony, same old hearsay. There is still no quid pro quo. Now, in response to that bombshell that Ambassador Taylor dropped today, that basically he his staff said that they overheard Ambassador Sondland on the phone talking to President Trump, and they were talking about investigating the Bidens. The president was asked directly about that at this news conference today, and he said, quote, "I know nothing about it. I've never heard it." He did not specifically say it never happened. He just said, "I know nothing about it." Basically, what we're hearing here at the White House is that officials here at the White House, the president himself, they have said they don't think impeachment is a good thing for the president because it is a stain on his legacy, but they almost see it as a foregone conclusion. They're not worried about it impacting the president with his base. If anything, they think this fires up the base instead of turning them off. Elaine?
Ben Tracy, thank you very much, Ben. Let's bring in the rest of our panel: Olivia Gazis, Anita Kumar, Eugene Scott, and Rikki Kleiman. Olivia is a CBS News intelligence and national security reporter. Anita is a White House correspondent and associate editor at Politico. Eugene is a reporter for The Washington Post, and Rikki is a CBS News legal analyst. Welcome to all of you. Olivia, what more do we know about this phone call Bill Taylor revealed in his testimony?
Right. So this was arguably the biggest revelation of the day, Elaine, apart from the fact that the hearing happened itself. But David Holmes, who CBS News confirmed to be the staffer in question, is a mid-career Foreign Service official, by all accounts, a serious and well-respected professional. We spoke to the former Deputy Secretary of State, Bill Burns, who said he was one of the best he'd ever served with. And Holmes, according to Taylor's testimony, has offered a new direct link between the president and this order for investigations, a clearer link than we have heard before. So as you recap there, Holmes apparently was in a restaurant at the time that Ambassador Taylor and Volker were at the front lines. He was instead with Ambassador Sondland and overheard this conversation between the ambassador and President Trump, in which the aide said that he heard the word "the investigations" uttered by President Trump, and that when he then asked Ambassador Sondland about what the president thought of Ukraine, he was told that the president cared more about the investigations into Joe Biden. I'm sure that we will hear more about this account because Adam Schiff, in a post-hearing presser, confirmed that, in fact, he is the person who is going to be deposed this Friday, which happens to be the same day that we'll have a second public hearing from, of course, the former ambassador, Marie Masha Yovanovitch. But behind closed doors, we can expect David Holmes, this official, this aide to Bill Taylor, also to Yovanovitch, testifying about what exactly he heard on that call between Ambassador Sondland and President Trump.
Anita, how might this revelation from Ambassador Taylor affect the White House's messaging and strategy around impeachment?
It feels like we saw something a little bit or heard something a little bit different today. They had a couple talking points ready, and we had sort of mentioned a little bit before we had heard one, which is this is a game of telephone, that there's no direct link to the president. No one has heard that. So this actually obviously goes against that. You heard the president earlier saying he didn't know what they were talking about. He doesn't know about this call. So it does hurt that strategy a little. The other two things they were talking about was why is everybody complaining that Ukraine didn't get aid? Actually, the president and this administration did give the aid to Ukraine, something that they claim that the Obama administration didn't do. And so you should say, this administration did a good job, not a bad job. And then the third thing they've been talking about is how this is just unelected bureaucrats who disagree with the president, disagree with his policy, but it's the president who's elected to make those decisions, and they're just fighting back as they disagree. And so those are the things that we have heard today, and I think that we will continue to hear them Friday and then into next week.
Eugene, I'm wondering, this is, in fact, a political process that we are seeing unfold. This is not a court of law. And ultimately, if in fact it comes to the point where members of the House decide that they will go ahead and proceed with drafting articles of impeachment, it then goes to the Senate for trial. Based on the line of questioning that we heard from Republicans in particular today, as well as some of the reaction in between during those breaks from people like Congressman Mark Meadows, for instance, is there any indication that there may be movement among Republicans based on what we heard today?
Not as of yet. I think what we saw from Republicans this time around is that they are strongly behind the president, defending him and his actions and his conversation and behavior, believing that he did not do anything that was, and at risk of being a high crime or a misdemeanor. And that's going to be very interesting when it comes time to address these issues in the Senate, because while we have Republicans in the House consistently saying that nothing inappropriate was done, we have Republicans in the Senate who believe that something was done, but it was not inappropriate. And that something obviously being the quid pro quo. And so the strategy seems still to be very different from both groups of Republicans, depending on where they are in Congress, and whether or not they're going to be on the same page anytime soon, especially after today, remains to be seen.
Rikki, let me turn to you. As I just mentioned, this is not a court of law. Really, this is about the court of public opinion. Nevertheless, we hear things like due process. We hear things like claims of hearsay. As a legal expert, give us some context here for understanding in a court of law what is hearsay, and in a procedure like this, is due process part and parcel of that procedure?
Well, let me start with the second. When we consider due process is always something we consider in a criminal case. Mm-hmm. And the Constitution and the constitutional amendments, particularly the 14th, provide for it. And when we look at what process is due, what we're talking about for the president to call his own witnesses, for the president really to have his lawyers come in and cross-examine witnesses, that happens at the time of a trial. If you're going to analogize it to a criminal proceeding, the trial takes place in the Senate. If we look at this process, which is the question of whether or not there will be a formal accusation, it is much more analogous to the grand jury. And in the grand jury, the defendant does not have a right to be present. The defendant does not have the right to have counsel present. There is no cross-examination of the government's witness. It says the government gets to give its own case in a private room. So what's happened here is this is like a hybrid. Although we're dealing with the ultimate question of whether or not what we see this week, next week, perhaps even further weeks, will then go to the Judiciary Committee for the Judiciary Committee to decide by a majority vote whether or not it will go to the full House. So I would say, looking at today, you had a lawyer for each side. You had all of those congressional people able to ask questions or make speeches, that the president got a lot of due process.
Eugene, President Trump has repeatedly said this is all about his efforts to root out corruption in Ukraine. George Kent told lawmakers today investigating the Biden family is, quote, not anti-corruption. Break down for us how this debate over what constitutes corruption is playing out politically.
Well, it's been interesting because it certainly depends on which side of the aisle you are speaking to. We saw Democrats say that if the president was really interested in addressing issues of corruption, he would start with his own administration. But we have those on the right who believe that Hunter Biden did something inappropriate because of his father's position, and that it was based on something that was perhaps corrupt or maybe even illegal, and that the Trump administration has a responsibility to actually get to the bottom of it. But there's a lack of consistency from those on the right defending the president because there seems not to be its equal amounts of concerns about the role of perhaps favor and nepotism when it comes to perhaps the Trump family specifically. And so ideas about corruption have been quite different, and we're seeing that on display in these hearings based on who is asking questions and providing answers. But at the end of the day, how people define it primarily seem to be divided by partisan lines.
Rikki, I want to go back to this notion of hearsay. So the president asked this week why there's such a focus on, quote, second and third hand witnesses in this investigation. The White House press secretary today told CBS News that this case is all hearsay. Give us a primer on what exactly hearsay is. When you hear that term thrown around, what does it actually mean in a legal context?
If I see you walking down the street with Joan Smith, I can say I have seen you because I'm a direct witness to what I have seen. If I also get close enough to you and Joan Smith and I can hear you, I can also repeat what you say because I have directly heard it. However, if at some point you come up to me and say, Rikki, Joan Smith told me the following, well, that's hearsay. So the president and his colleagues who are criticizing the fact about hearsay is that the whistleblower's complaint is clearly based on hearsay. There are people who were involved in the call who then let the whistleblower know about their particular concerns, and this person, the whistleblower, reports it. However, those people who are on the call, who heard what was said, they can testify to it directly, which brings us to Bill Taylor, Ambassador Taylor's addendum today about having a staff member allegedly hear the president have a call with Mr. Sondland. I say that Gordon Sondland is the most important witness in this case, at least that's far that I know. And Gordon Sondland will arrive next week, and we will get to hear from him because he's the one who's having direct conversations with the president.
So, Olivia, when we are talking about these second-hand witnesses, the White House has previously blocked those closer to the president from appearing. That includes former National Security Advisor John Bolton and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. How might that complicate Republicans' defense?
Well, I think as Rikki just elaborated, it may weaken it because it exposes something of a contradiction, of course, because these are people who arguably are better equipped to testify, but the White House is nevertheless preventing them from doing so. They've made the same argument about the whistleblower not having firsthand knowledge, but we now know that the ICIG, in fact, confirmed that the whistleblower had at least some firsthand knowledge. It's a moot point anyway, because the Democrats are never going to let that person testify out in the open. But what Republicans tried to revert to today were, again, just as the White House is, accusations that these are first, second, third-hand accounts from people who don't have direct knowledge, don't have a relationship with the president. But what you also have to take note of is that these are, this is not just one person with a hearsay account. It is a critical mass of, it's now 15 people who have testified behind closed doors, and 11 from which we're going to hear publicly, at least, over the next 2 weeks. And those accounts have all sort of centered around the same narrative and the same sort of set of facts. The Republicans did very little, I think, today to poke holes in those things. They did raise sort of the sort of standard criticism that this is a continuation of the Russia hoax. You heard the ranking member, Devin Nunes, today say, to Kent and Taylor seated before him, that they were part of the, quote, low-rent Ukrainian sequel to those hearings. So those were attacks that were sort of, a bit more superficial. They didn't really undermine the credibility of either man. They didn't really go after or poke holes in their recollection of events. They mainly said that they were at a distance that was, not entirely persuasive from the facts at hand, and that's something that I think you'll see them continue to use as a tactic, as we have more of these public hearings.
Anita, you reported today that frustrated allies of the president are urging him to stop talking about himself. How much do these concerns revolve around impeachment itself versus the re-election and how that might be impacted down the road?
Well, it's all about the election. They think that if the president can, as the president often does, he talks about himself and how the attacks are on him, which obviously they are. This is impeachment. But if he can talk about how it impacts voters and his supporters, people who voted for him 2016, who have continued to support him, that he started a movement, if you will, and that those are the people that the Democrats are hurting. They're hurting half the country who ended up voting for him. And so they really do want him to make it more about voters across the country. And this is a message they want him to take to his rallies, to Twitter, to speeches, so that they can galvanize people for his election. Because remember, they do feel pretty confident that the House will vote to impeach, but then it'll go to the Senate and he would be acquitted, not removed from office, but he'll have to face re-election. And so they want to use this as a way to sort of energize their base and supporters.
Thank our panel here, and we'll move on. Olivia Gazis, Anita Kumar, Eugene Scott, and Rikki Kleiman. Thanks to you all.